Blog Talk Radio.
We are the last generation. It's time for this conflict to end. It's time for us to understand who and what we are as beings of people. The original indigenous beings of North America. There are more so-called black men in prison today than were enslaved in 1850. And for over 100 years, it's been talked about movements that took you nowhere, near the claim of freedom, leaders that promised independence from a system of war that is meant to genocide us all off the face of this earth. Movements that have been destroyed, our leaders killed, in a war that has been raging on since and before 1492, towards the carbon-based beings of this world, of this North America, of you. Now it is time to bring this conflict to an end. For those in the memory that gave their lives in the defense of our civilizations, revolt after revolt, those have been slaughtered and killed as a part of this war. Everyone knows something has to change. So we will rise and become who we are truly designed to be. Original indigenous beings of the Bronze Race. Out of the ashes, we will reform a civilization that was set for dead. The civilization of the indigenous beings of North America. There's been an awakening. Have you felt it? You are listening to Dark Matter Radio with your host, Ronnie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you may be in this beautiful world of ours. Welcome to Dark Matter Radio, heard in over 13 countries around the world. We're talking about Switzerland, British Columbia, Canada. We're all over Canada, actually, the United States, South Africa, Australia, India, Egypt. Welcome to the people over there in Egypt. We're talking also about the United Kingdom, and even Israel, right? Our friends over there in Israel listening, and this is going to be a great show for everyone around this planet because it is going to get into the oldest DNA on the planet, making the case for the oldest DNA on the planet concerning so-called human civilization with Dr. Fatou. We're going to bring her on now, right away. I just want to read a couple of things just to begin to start setting the tone because this is extremely important for everyone, basically. And one of the things I want to read is that man was on, this is out of a book called The Primitive Man in Ohio. It was written back in 1895 by Dr. Moorhead. And what he did, he wrote a book describing the people of the indigenous valleys of Ohio. And one of the first statements that he made was man was on the continent, the United States or the North American continent, the Americas, right, says, at the period when the climate and ice of Greenland extended to the mouth of the New York Harbor, and possibly is that if he was in New Jersey at that time, he was also upon the banks of Ohio and an extensive trace of gravel deposits in the southern part of the state of Ohio proved that to be so. The last chapter in his book, he wrote, "We cannot overlook the fact that the Karna," now he dug up the actual artifacts, the actual bones of the actual people that were here in the Americas that he was talking about. And him, along with other archaeologists, came to this conclusion. We cannot overlook the fact that the Karna and the skeletons examined by us, many of them excavated by our own hands, meaning that they were real. They had the actual skeletons themselves and didn't go off for anybody else's reports, approach somewhat the Negro in their autonomal characteristics. They were those of an inferior race, and that's how you know it's probably true when they found that, because anything that looks Negro, they always, or black, whatever you want to call them, they're always saying it's inferior to their race, with strong meso, meaning very ancient, and branchy, prolific affinities. None of the characteristics of the Mongolian or Mongoloid, meaning none of the Asian types of any of that era, were present in any of the Ohio Karna which we have examined. They are evidently those of the people whose racial type was created and fixed on the American continent, which ranges from all the way up to the Alaska and all the way down to Peru into Antarctica. In other words, the American race. So with that, let me bring on the doctor. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great.
I'm doing well, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you very well.
Okay, good.
I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and how you actually got into this area of DNA from the field that you're currently in.
Well, my name is Dr. Fatou Diara. I'm a general internist, and I got into DNA with a focus particularly on the so-called African American to the Caribbean populations, because I've, for years, basically, have had interest in the Afro-American history, the true history of our people. And a lot has been hidden from us. I started putting together early, from the time of my late teens, that the traditional history that was fed to our people wasn't really so. Many of your listening audience, if they're familiar with me, know that my father is Ghanaian, so I come from a background where I descend from two different populations. My mother was from Northeast North Carolina, pardon me, Halifax County, North Carolina, and my father was from Ghana, West Africa. So, growing up with both my mom and dad, I just sort of was able to see that these were just two different populations. They were not the same. And yet, this was not reflected in the traditional history that was given to us. And then by the time I was, let's say, 19, 20, I really started getting into genealogy of my mom's side. Now, I grew up knowing about my dad's side. My father was very good with oral history. He could tell me about the migrations, where they migrated from, and about his ancestors. But there was always that void that was missing on my mom's side. And I took a deep interest in this because I knew intuitively something was missing. Now, but I always sensed that my mom family descended from the original populations here. Nobody told me this. Now, I know that many so-called African Americans have this type of dynamic where their grandmothers told them that they were part Native. Now, I grew up hearing that all around me. But in my own personal family, I didn't really come out of that tradition. So I didn't really have that. But somehow or another, from childhood years, I had an inner knowing that my mom's family somehow or another was linked to the Southeast tribes. And there was no way, I didn't learn this from anybody. I just had a feeling that even though it was not part of the oral history passed down in my family, it was so. Now, when I started getting into genealogy, I did not start making any breakthroughs until a distant cousin alerted me that some of the surnames in our families may not very well be linked to slave owners, but in fact, indigenous tribes down there, and they would have these European surnames. Right. So once I was alerted to that, then my breakthroughs started happening because, of course, I had some of those surnames in my family tree. And what I concluded after just doing years of genealogy and becoming familiar with the different tribes down in North Carolina, Virginia, and stuff like that, it's not, and, you know, even if it was an indirect type of relationship to them, what I concluded by the time, I would say a good 15 years later, was that whatever population was down there, it was very clear to me that my family was a descendant of these various different native populations down in the Southeast, mixed with, back then, I'm sorry, hold on a second.
Yep.
Mixed with, back then, I would say transported African slaves, because that's where my mind was back then. So at least in my mind, I knew that I was dealing with a population that had a good portion of their lineage native to down there. So as this information started increasing, and then over time, you know, fast forward, I'm meeting people online in different groups, and this is now becoming a mainstream discussion. And the other thing that started becoming popular at the same time of people discovering their indigenous roots was genetic testing. Okay, so I remember when DNA tests first came out, I did the genetic testing on my mom, and at the time one of her sisters who was alive. And I just really, you know, being that I do have a science background, I like the whole concept of DNA testing and, of course, genealogy as well. But what I was seeing was that the DNA test didn't seem to correlate the indigenous label, if you understand what I mean. So the two were not adding up together, and yet we were getting results that were telling us that we were primarily African. Now, it's not as if we don't have an approximate number of directly transported Africans that came into the African trade via the African slave trade. It's not like we don't have numbers, and we know not that many came into North America, but yet we have this predominant African DNA. So I went on to study that, and why is that, and why it doesn't seem to line up with the oral history. What is going on? So I started looking at our genetic patterns. I started looking at people who belong to the tribes because, of course, in the process of doing my own lineage and genealogy and participating in DNA studies, I would be related to some of the members who belong to the tribes, which gave me access to see what was inside of their DNA test. Now, the advantage that the people who belong to tribes have versus people who are non-tribal members, your so-called prototypical African American, is that they have access to their records and lineages for most of them, they don't come out of enslaved lineages as well. So they're able to stand firm on their identities, yet they would have a similar genetic pattern that the rest of us have. Now, how does one explain that? And that's where I come in. So it required me looking at DNA studies that were done on tribal members, and there are geneticists who have done that. It required me studying our genetic pattern. It required me studying the genetic pattern of other populations around the planet. Mm-hmm. And last but not least, the greatest contributing, the greatest, I would say, contribution to my understanding in terms of understanding our DNA has been Tyrone Lewis Cannon, who wrote the dissertation. I always encourage the listening audience to go look up Tyrone Lewis, Lewis, Cannon, Cannon, scientific dissertation. And the reason why I will always reference that, because in truth, that study that he did, which stands up to this day, is the one proof that we can all stand on to prove that portion of our lineage was here from ancient times, okay? And I will, go into that as the interview goes on. But there were other things that I observed, and that's where I come in. That's basically my story of how I got into all of this.
That is wonderful, and that's where we're coming up with this show tonight, because we're making the case for the oldest DNA on the planet. Now, making the case, right, concerning the so-called humans. And so wanted to do a deep dive into this dark matter once and for all and put this question to rest, hopefully, right, by having you breaking down the so-called African-American, the so-called black DNA, and where it actually really fits in this DNA timeline on the polygenic tree, if it's even on that tree. We'll get into that a little bit later. And as you didn't bring up, you've been all over social media for quite a number of years. I would say more than 5, 6, 7, 8 years, doing shows with Phoenix Moon, Tasha Zai. You did a show on the genetic composition of the so-called African Americans on Pice TV. In fact, you did a couple of Pice TV studies. Another one was on the deeper dive into the African American and Caribbean DNA, which was extremely important, because that broke down a lot of stuff in terms of admixture and everything like that. And and with the stuff with Phoenix Moon and Tasha Zai, you actually began to start introducing people to the notion of what this DNA stuff was all about. So tonight, you talked about that. I forgot the guy's name. It's an African American, quote unquote African American. They did that parental lineage test on him and found
Albert Perry.
Albert
Perry.
That his roots were, that his DNA wasn't even on the polygenic tree as everyone else through his Y chromosome. And we'll get into that as well. But I just want everybody to know that it's not like you just woke up one day, but you've been studying this with people all around the world. I mean, I believe people down there in Australia, people over there in Britain, across the Great Pond, as I call it. You've been studying a lot of stuff with a lot of people. So this is going to be very interesting. So let's really get into it. And again, sometimes I might go off. I might take a rowboat away from the main ship. So you just pull me back in whenever you have to, so that we stay on course. So let's get into our origins in terms of the DNA and what you've seen in that, in terms of what possibly is the oldest DNA on the planet, and how does that relate to actually Africa and other DNA specimens?
Well, we know that the oldest DNA is labeled African, and there are different types of categories of African DNA. You have the pygmies, the Khoisan. Then you have what we call Bantu DNA. I know some people consider the word Bantu a pejorative, but for the purposes of genetic classification, I will use it because it is relating to an area in Africa that stems from the Nigerian-Cameroon border going across to southern Ethiopia, Kenya, going all the way down into South Africa, but not including the Khoisan, or properly known as the Khoi area. And so when we start talking about Bantu, those are the areas that we're referring to, okay? So basically, when you get a DNA test, right, your DNA is being compared to different populations across the globe through the method of single nucleotide polymorphism, SNAPs. So just think of SNAPs, even though I'm oversimplifying it, as a type of genetic similarity or resemblance, okay? So you will find that if you look at the primordial DNA of all populations, you can look at ancient skeletons, you can look at Neanderthal even. If you look at, let me just put Neanderthal aside. Let's just say ancient skeletons. Well, no, we're going to leave Lucy aside. Let's leave archaic beings out of it, okay? So let's just say Otzi, who's a 5,000-year-old mummy, okay? And we have his Jed match kit, pardon me. And so if you plug in Otzi and you look at his primordial populations, which would be the secondary populations or any of the genetic oracles, you'll see that Otzi gets pygmy and he gets a little Bantu. Okay. Now, if you take a West African and you map their DNA out, you will see that the earlier part of the West African is primarily pygmy, and it also is Bantu. So where I'm going is that when you map out any population, including African people, the earlier part of their DNA will ultimately go back to the Bantu and the pygmies. I don't care if they're from the Horn African section, the West African section, the Central African section, the North African section. If you look at Polynesians, and I learned this from a geneticist who owns his own genetic company, Native DNA to be specific, he will tell you that Polynesians have on average 20 to 25% Bantu DNA, and the rest will be mixtures of Southeast Asians and other Asiatic groups. Now, the reason why that's not known to the majority of people, and maybe only to the individuals like himself, is the geneticists create groups called genetic communities. And what's happening is that what happens is that the average person, the lay person, does not understand the difference between the genetic component and the genetic community. So what happens is that, you have these different organizations that went around the world and they pretty much sampled the DNA populations, pretty much from the majority of the population of the world around the globe. And what happens is that let's say, so someone is from Vietnam or Cambodia and they have a certain genetic type of pattern, SNAP pattern. If you take that test and your ancestors come from Cambodia, Vietnam, it'll pick that up and it'll allocate a portion of your DNA to those populations, right? And you'll say, well, that's correct. So what's the problem? There's no problem because that's the correct genetic community. But what's inside of the Cambodian? They didn't tell you that. They just identified the area. You understand? And that's the slight nuance and trick of that when it comes to identifying us, because what happens is they have not given us a genetic community. They have just exposed our components, but you're not aware of the components of these other groups of people. So a geneticist is aware of the components. So what this geneticist told me, because it's of his personal interest, being that his father was part Hawaiian, He studied the Hawaiian population along with other Polynesians. And in their least miscegenated form, because of course now many of them are quite admixed with Europeans and other people that have settled there, but in their least miscegenated form, he said that they are on average 20 to 25% Bantu. The reason why you and I don't see that is because when they take DNA tests, they are allocated to the genetic group of Tahiti, Fiji, and East Hawaii, or whatever their categories are. So you don't see what's inside of a Fijian. But
Wow.
he will tell you as a geneticist that they are 20 to 25% Fijian. Now, there is a genetic testing company called, Bantu DNA, I'm sorry. There is a genetic company called DNA Consultants. Now, DNA Consultant identified a gene called the Mozambican gene, okay? And what they've noticed is that the Mozambican gene, and Mozambique also is in the Bantu area, take note of that. They found that that Mozambican gene is present in a small percentage of so-called African Americans, Navajo, Native Americans, and Tibetans. Now, the only reason I'm bringing that up is to point out that, once again, DNA that has an African label is not exclusive to Africa. So that's what I'm pointing out. Southeast Asians have a certain percentage of African DNA, but you're not seeing it because they are identified with their genetic community. What you will come to realize is that African DNA is all over the globe. It is all over the globe, and it is not exclusive to Africa. Africans just have the highest percentage. But everybody else is identified with their genetic community, so you don't get to see the percentage of African DNA they have, except for so-called Afro-Americans or Caribbeans or South Americans. Our African DNA is exposed.
Interesting. So a genetic community would be like,
right,
okay, you're gonna say I'm from Britain. That's my genetic community, but within that genetic community,
let me explain what the genetic community. Let me explain what the genetic community is, so you understand. The genetic community is basically any group of people that have basically lived in the area, intermixed among themselves. Okay, and so therefore, there's a certain amount of shared ancestors just by virtue of living in proximity within a certain area, and it can range anywhere from a minimum of 50 years, which allows at least for 2 generations, to 300 years. That will allow you to be included into that genetic community.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay. So we as so-called African Americans, when we participate in, let's say, Ancestry DNA, they give us genetic communities, but they call it African American genetic communities. So we'll get like North Carolina, border Virginia, early North Carolina African American community. Now, inside those African American communities, quote unquote, you will see of the African DNA, and it will say Cameroon, Congo / Nigerian, and things of that nature. If you look at the Lumbee genetic community, and I've seen that genetic community, it's the Robeson County Lumbee African American genetic community. They acknowledge that the Lumbee Indians are indeed a Native American population, but within that genetic community, you have the Cameroon, Congo, and okay? Now, when you read about that particular genetic community, they would tell you that that genetic community was formed by the Native American population who joined forces with some African Maroons, and they formed a genetic community and ran, or primarily stayed into the Great Dismal Swamp area, right? And those African Maroons, which is another topic, were really people that was part of the armies of the conquistadors. They were Moors, and they fled and they intermarried with the local indigenous population. But look at the prevailing DNA that's found there, Cameroon, Congo.
Yeah.
Okay. So where I'm going is that DNA was found all over the planet. It's not exclusive to so-called African Americans. It's not exclusive to the African continent. But because you and I don't have the ability to see what's inside everyone else's genetic community, we don't know that. If you don't meet a geneticist who's honest enough to tell you this, you're not going to know that Polynesians are 20 to 25% Bantu type DNA. You're not going to know that. So it appears as if we're the only ones with that DNA. Do you understand?
I understand.
And all it is a marker of your ingenuity, indigenuity, pardon me. All it is a marker of your ancientness. If you claim that you are indigenous to any land population, then you should also have evidence of being the oldest genetically. And we know that the oldest DNA will be DNA that they label African. And of course, like I said, there's different types of African DNA, Pygmy, Khoisan, Bantu, and then you have the West African type DNA. I'm saying West African type because they weren't always in West Africa.
Yeah.
That's another topic, but it's a type. But all of this DNA is the oldest DNA on the planet. And even of the West Africans, their older DNA is Bantu and Pygmy. So how can anyone be indigenous to a landmass without having that DNA? They cannot. So
that's right.
Right. So the key first is to understand that is not exclusive to the African continent. If you don't know that, then then here you have people who have paper trails to prove that they've been here, that they are in fact indigenous to this landmass in North America. But then they have this African DNA, and then that's used to argue that, in fact, they are not native to this land. But when you look at the timeline of certain Mexicans, and you look at the timeline of the Afro-American population, that's what gives away the answer. You can get into the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
We have to talk about Tyrone Lewis Cannon's scientific dissertation, because in that scientific dissertation, which your audience can Google or go into any search engine, is there for you to read. It's public information. He did a study, and his study was based on using 23andMe ancestry testing company.
Yep.
And the reason why 23andMe Ancestry Testing Company is a good company when it comes to this particular point is what they don't do is hide any percentage you have of Native American and Southeast Asian DNA. And the reason why that's very important is because with Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, and other companies, they choose to not report results that are beneath a certain threshold that they already predetermined. And that's their right. So if they determine that you're under 3% and they won't report a result under 3%, that's their right. But that does not mean you do not have a percentage. And the reason why that's important is because if lay people, these are the tests, and it comes out with no evidence of Native American and Southeast Asian, they will say, well, I don't have it. No, you don't have enough of a percentage that met that particular company's threshold for reporting. But when you use third-party DNA tests that were created by geneticists where all percentages are reported, you will see it, if you understand what I mean. So 23andMe reports all percentages of Native American and Southeast Asian DNA. Now, the reason why I'm zooming in on those two populations, right, we're not the same as the people that are labeled Native American today. Those are Asian descendants who've been here at most for 10,000 years. So they do have a claim in their ancient presence here. I'm not taking that away from them. But no, they are not the most ancient here, and that I can prove. And the reason why that DNA is something we still need to discuss, right? Because what Tyrone Lewis Cannon showed in his studies was that using a sample population of 300 and something, I believe 330, but your audience can go look at the study, but let's say 300 something African Americans, so-called African Americans, he showed that 88% had Southeast Asian DNA. Okay? Now, when you add Southeast Asian plus Native American markers, that number went up to 99.5% of his sample population. Now, why is this significant? Because the Austronesians, who tend to have the Southeast Asian markers, were the earliest seafarers on the planet. And for almost 90% of us to possess those markers would mean that a substantial portion of our lineage had to be here to greet them. That's the significance of that. And we know that the proto-Mongoloid...
One more time? They had to be here to greet them? Say that?
Yes, they had to be here to greet them. They had to be in the Americas to greet these Austronesian markers. I mean, these Austronesian individuals.
Yeah.
That's how we gained the markers. The Madagascar argument can't hold up because we know no more than 2,000 actual slaves came from Madagascar. We're 40 million. You can't explain the Madagascar slave trade all the way in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar, facing the Indian Ocean. You can't explain bringing people from there as to why almost 90% of us possess those markers alone. Now, some people from Mexico also have those markers. Some people from Central America also have those markers. Not all of them. Some of the Cree Indians from Canada also have those markers. And I know that from a geneticist. Okay? So there is evidence that mixing with various groups in North America took place, which means a portion of their lineage had to be quite ancient. And that is why when African Americans, so-called African Americans, participate in 23andMe, they get a little bit of Southeast Asian, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, and they're like, what am I doing with this? And often when you look in the comment section, because they don't have this understanding, they attribute it to slavery from Madagascar. There wasn't enough numbers from Madagascar to explain that pervasive finding, no matter where we come from.
So their narrative just doesn't match up to the actual facts of the matter.
Exactly. And that is a very key point that Tyrone Lewis Cannon made with that study. It is extremely important because it is a persistent genetic trait that we possess. It is literally part of our genetic ancestral composition. So I can identify a person without them even opening their mouth. I could just look at their genetic pattern. I don't have to see a name. I don't have to see a face. And I can identify that person as a so-called Afro-American because it is literally our genetic pattern. Now, when you look at the people from Mexico who do possess Southeast Asian DNA, right? And they have the Cameroon Congo, if it's Ancestry DNA, or the Angola Congo, Southeast African, which is the Bantu marker in 23andMe. If you look at the timeline, now, what 23andMe does is they have something called an ancestry timeline where they take the DNA that you have, and they look at which part of that DNA came in earlier. So the DNA that came in the most recent is at the top, and the earlier part of your DNA is at the bottom. Well, if you take a Mexican who does possess these Austronesian markers, and you put the timeline of that Mexican side by side to a so-called African American, what you will see is both of them have the same ancestral pattern at the beginning part of their timeline. You will see the Bantu DNA next to the Bantu DNA next to the Southeast Asian DNA, which is the Austronesian, and then as you move up the timeline, then you will get the Native American, for both. The Native American will come in afterwards, okay? And that is what I wanted to state. So the Native American, according to these DNA tests, is not the earliest person here in the Americas.
Gotcha.
So how can people who have that label claim to be here before those of us who have the Austronesian marker? When people who have those Austronesian markers, who are primarily Native American genetically, that is the earlier portion of their DNA.
Understood.
And we have the earlier portions of their DNA. We are the earlier portions of their DNA.
In other words, they stem from us. We didn't stem from them.
Let's put it this way. If they have the earlier portion of our DNA and we still possess that aspect of our DNA, and they've been now highly miscegenated with the newcomers, so their phenotype has changed.
Gotcha.
I'm not claiming that they stem from us. I'm saying that they share an ancient lineage with us, but because they are more admixed with the newcomer, who has been given the label of being the face of the indigenous people, they get to claim that. Speaking strictly from genetics, they have a part of their DNA that's just as ancient as ours because it's the same. It's just that we did not mix with the newcomer as much. We did some mixing, but not as much as they did. So we didn't take on the phenotype of the Mongol people that came in, although we have their admixture in our genome. So we are literally being excluded from the label of this place being our home because we did not take on the phenotype, because we did not admix on a large scale with the Mongol.
So so in a sense, what the so-called African American population, which is the indigenous population, they didn't mix as much as everybody else did. Their genetic pool was more close knit, close tight, whereas some of the other ones that you're referring to now, they heavily mixed in with new populations that came into the continent.
Exactly. So this would be those Mexicans, let's say some of them from the state of Oaxaca, who still possess the Austronesian markers. That's a part of our family that was left there, that now mixed in more with the newcomers.
In other words, they were almost breeded out of existence, or breeded out of existence of their phenotype.
Almost, but those areas also have maintained phenotypes. So these would be people that are being labeled Afro-Mexican and also being told that they are newcomers and descendants of African slaves. You have that going on also over there as well. Some of them have maintained their phenotype. Some of them show more miscegenation because they're surrounded by Asian descendants.
Gotcha.
We were a larger group that maintained more isolation. Those of us that are from the more southern regions that are near Mexico have a little bit more Mesoamerican mixture as well, because you had some of our tribes that were formed from people that left Mexico.
So when we're talking about the age, like Austral DNA, are we talking about people from Australia?
When we say Austronesian, that's in reference to the a combination of the islands that we find in Pacific Islands mixed with people from Southeast Asia.
No signal.
Oh, it's a zone.
Okay. All right. So it's not necessary, because what a lot of people get mixed up with is that when a lot of these geneticists come up, they say that we are descendants from people from Australia, which is the oldest DNA on the planet. I just wanted to get that understanding.
Yeah,
correct.
Australian DNA is not the oldest because we have DNA markers. Let's say Y haplogroup C is considered Australoid. We have haplogroup A, which is older, and haplogroup B, which is older than haplogroup C. So they are not the oldest. They're up there. They're the third brother. I put it that way.
Yeah.
But they're not the firstborn. They're not the secondborn. And the thirdborn, they're older than haplogroup E, which is now predominant among us.
All right, so we're putting that to rest right now. We are not Australoids. We're not those people from Australia.
No, but we have some of them influencing us genetically. Yeah. Some people will argue they came from over here. See, I don't get into those types of arguments, but I can tell you genetically, yeah, we have their genetic similarity, some of us more than others.
All right. Now, does any of these groups have what they would call the A00 genetic marker?
We do. We match in terms of genetic similarity. You have the Shuma Laka Cameroon site, which primarily the skeletons in those regions were closest to what we call the Khoisan people. We know Albert Perry had that Y haplogroup A00, which after it was discovered in Albert Perry's descendant, then they went on to look for it, and then they found the closest to that in the MBO people of Cameroon. So then, using the whole we got transported from Africa argument, then it was suggested that therefore Albert Perry's ancestor had to be carried from Africa. But Tyrone Lewis Cannon analyzed this and wrote a paper, which I think is also public for anyone to read, and he was able to prove that Albert Perry's DNA was 11 mutational steps different than the MBO sample that they are saying is the same. So this is why it's very important that our people take on the study of genetics and break things down, because if we don't, then we will be constantly fed lies. It is not exactly the same as the MBO people. And Tyrone Lewis Cannon proved that. It's not exactly the same. Similarity ain't the same.
Now, as we're making this case for the oldest DNA on the planet, and what group actually has it, When you start talking about the A00, what do they call haplogroup? I guess it is.
Mm-hmm.
There are some geneticists that actually put that A00 on a totally different genetic tree. What can you say about that?
Well, the only thing I have to say about that is just lets you know that as we continue to dig, the more we continue to discover. And, you know, when it comes to it, all it does is it just proves that what is being conventionally taught to us is not true, as more truth to be revealed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm even addressing your question correctly.
You are.
Maybe I didn't.
No, you are, because you know, I mean, this gets into the point where, you know, when they were looking at his DNA, they were fiercely trying to match his DNA with anything in Africa. I mean, they were overturning everything in Africa, and the closest, I think they came up with two groups. The closest group that they came up with was the group that you mentioned before, which was the Cameroons.
The Embo people.
Embo.
Right. Yeah, it was. They discovered his DNA and then went scraping through Africa to find the match, and then want to come back and say, well, then that's where he was taken from. No, because it's not exact. It's 11 mutational steps different. Again, that will require someone who understands genetics and how to decipher and break it down to determine that. If you don't have that understanding, or at least confer with someone who does, then you're left with this false narrative again.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to get some names right here. There's a geneticist called Michael Hammer. I think he's out of the University of Arizona, and he was explaining to people that the data from these tests show that all men gain their Y chromosome from a common male ancestor, the genetic Adam, who lived between 60,000 and 140,000 years. And what they found with this DNA testing, which I believe, by reading all the different reports, they tested more than just his blood. But out of the 240 genetic tests they did with his blood or his DNA, they found out that he was at least 340,000 years older than the nearest match from the 140,000 year old sample that they got that said that was actually from Adam himself.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that saying, are they also making the case that the real indigenous Americans, what they actually call the American race, has the oldest DNA on the planet, possibly?
Yeah, that's what it suggests. That's what it's suggesting. The other thing, too, is that, remember I said when we started this interview that Bantu-type DNA is older than West African DNA, and that when you look at West Africans and you break down their DNA, the older part of their DNA is Pygmy and Bantu. Remember I said that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, just on a simple type of logic, if most of our genetic pattern is primarily Bantu type, right? And West African DNA, when broken down, the older part of the West African is Bantu, and we're primarily Bantu. How can West Africans be our parents?
Very interesting.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Very,
See,
very difficult to justify that.
I'm just working before me. I'm not dealing with anything else because I look at West African people's DNA and I see that their primordial populations are Bantu out of Kenya, Pygmy, Hadza people who are hunter-gatherer, Bantu population in Southeast Africa, the Sandawe people. Like, I see who their primordial ancestors are. And if we are primarily genetically similar to the Bantu population and the Bantu population are their primordial ancestors, how are they our parents when we are more closely related to the older part of them? They cannot be. So that right there blows holes in that theory. Huh?
It sure does. It sure does. And that's why I tell a lot of people.
So, they need to determine which part of Africa they claiming we come from, because when you read certain texts, they're saying that a certain percentage came from the Windward Coast, certain percentage came from the Bida Benin. Well, if you want to use all of these arguments, whether we came from the Senegambia and the Rice Coast, all of that DNA from those regions are primarily West African. You start getting into a more Central African pattern, or a Bantu pattern, I should say, when you start getting from Cameroon down going into Angola, then that becomes primarily a Bantu pattern. But you can't hold up this flimsy argument of saying that we primarily came out of this particular region, which is West Africa, and those people are not primarily Bantu genetically. They're West African genetically, but we're primarily Bantu genetically. So the DNA doesn't add up to their...
And this is why I tell people, everything's got a narrative. When you start looking at these narratives that they put out there very closely, things start to break down very quickly, as what you're describing right here, in terms of, when you look at it logically and through through the actual receipts of the text. It's a lot of things that are hard to explain when you begin to start really looking at things in a very calm, educational way, and then you begin to start understanding that there are a whole lot of things that were told to our people just to make sure they can never find out exactly who and what they are, and to be able to claim whatever inheritance that they're truly involved in, or should be able to have. That gets into a lot of other things, but I mean, you had mentioned one time that one of the differences is that a certain part of the quote-unquote Native Americans and the actual indigenous Americans that haven't really changed who they are too much. One, they took two different ways in terms of siding with whoever they were going to side with. One gave up the land, and the other one was fighting to keep their land, and then ended up as prisoners of war. Some people call it slavery, whatever you have to say. The other people ended up getting reservations. So it's very, very, and this is the reason why we need to have these kind of conversations, so that we can get down to the bottom of what we need to really have an understanding, so we can begin to start basing our movements in which way we should go in terms of how we are looking at quote unquote governmental moves, political moves. Are we occupied? Who are we as beings of people? Who should we be really supporting? Or should we be against each other? Or are we actually really understanding who we're from, even though we may not be able to know exactly what tribe we came from? Because at one point, I think in one of your interviews, you said it's difficult for some indigenous Americans to go past 1870 in terms of their DNA and finding out their heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And why would that be?
Repeat that last question.
That sometimes when people are looking at where they're from, who their families are, and they begin to start doing their lineage, they begin to start doing their ancestral, exploration. Some people can't go back as far as other people.
Right. You're right. Some people can't.
Yeah, and why would that be?
It has to do with, a lot of it, in my experience, is related to enslavement, because free people of color would be present on census records before 1870. And if you were enslaved, you were considered property. So, then you have to start going to slave schedules and things of that nature. So before 1870, if your ancestors were enslaved, you would not be found, which I find is used. And see, that's some of the reason I got into DNA, because I don't intend to use DNA to replace genealogy, but to me, when you use it with genealogy, it's a powerful tool. And here's the thing. If you cannot find your ancestors before records, before 1870, and you have what I called your Afro-American, so-called Afro-American genetic pattern with the Austronesian markers, you already know that a good portion of your lineage, a significant portion, is already indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
So it should give you that level of confidence that you may not be able to get names and dates, but you're at least dealing with a lineage that had indigenous connection. So if you have a grandparent alive or your grandparent's sibling alive, you may not be able to, again, go back to a certain point, but if you did a DNA swab and then you see grandmama's sister or her brother or your grandfather's sibling with these Austronesian markers, what is that telling you?
Mm-hmm.
It may not satisfy you in terms of your inability to get a name, but it should satisfy you in terms of knowing their identity.
So, like, it may not tell you what tribe you're from, but it will tell you from where you are, where you originated from.
Oh yeah.
Right. So
it may not tell me the tribe. It may not tell me the tribe, but it'll certainly tell me I'm indigenous to America, North America.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that I was trying to get. You can use DNA, yep.
But listen, we've reached a certain advancement now. If you do ancestry DNA and you look at the African American communities, that they're telling you those African American genetic communities are really the areas that your ancestors were in for the past several generations, it matches up with tribal affiliation. Your tribes are from those areas.
Interesting.
Many of these tribes no longer even exist. The tribes that are state recognized, some of them go back, but some of them are recent formations, but they're amalgamated tribes, meaning they are a mixture of several tribes that came together and, started intermingling among themselves and then petitioned the government. But their formation is new. Although they might be ancient, they're a combination of different, let's say like the Lumbees are a combination of Iroquois and Algonquian and Siouan tribes.
Yeah.
Is a fairly new creation. Just like the Saponis. And then you have other tribes, they've been around. They're not new. To your point, let's talk about, your bread and butter so-called African American who's saying, look here, I went back, I can't find ancestors before 1870. I want to know what tribes I come from. Yes, I see the Austronesian markers on my DNA test. Okay, I got it. I'm indigenous. Now what tribes do I come from? Well, if you do the Ancestry DNA, that's why when people ask me all the time, well, what DNA test should I do? I tell them definitely want to do more than one. And I always recommend doing Ancestry DNA. 23andMe proves, it shows the Austronesian marker. So you can see for yourself that those markers are present. It should give you confidence. Yeah, now I know that a lot of my lineage was ancient here. That's what that does for you. But in terms of getting down to tribal information, down to the areas where a large part of your lineage comes out of, that's where Ancestry DNA comes in. And they have the African American genetic communities, which are really the tribal communities that your forefathers came out of. Those are really tribal communities.
Now, aren't there? Which DNA company gives you the slider, or you can pay for the slider where it goes from, 50%, and then you can say 90% of what you actually mark down to, taking away all the.
That's 23andMe. That's
okay.
23andMe, and that's just a feature of it. It's not anything additional that you have to pay for. It automatically reports all of our test results at a 50% confidence level, and you can actually look at your test results reported at a 90% confidence level. So what you're bringing up is a very important point. And I actually should have made it when Wire Tribe interviewed me, but I addressed so many other things. Actually, that point proves that there's an over-exaggeration of linking us to West Africa, because when you look at the reports of your ancestry composition at 90% confidence, for let's say, for my uncle, I'll just use my uncle who did the test, pardon me, he was given 25% Nigerian in his African category, right? He was given 25% Nigerian, and he was given, let's say, under 1% Austronesian markers, and he was given like 20% on average European. When you take the confidence level and you change it to 90%, his 25% goes down to 4-point-something% Nigerian.
Wow.
His broadly African, which is a generic type of broadly African, goes up. Okay, that's a non-specific category where it basically just says ancestral informative markers with Africans. It's non-specific, right? That goes up. And then the European remains unchanged. And that 1% or less than 1% Austronesian DNA that he has, guess what?
Yep.
That remains unchanged too. It might have gone down by 0.1. So you had the greatest variation of changes from 50% confidence to 90% confidence in the African genetic category, which means that at 90% confidence, they completely lost confidence in that DNA, and it went to just 4.5%. But at 50% confidence, they gave you 25% Nigerian, which means they're literally just throwing a category at you that they're not confident in. They lost confidence in it, and can only at 90% confidence told you really only have 4-point-something and change % of that actual DNA. But the European DNA, we from 50% to 90%, oh, we're sure that's European DNA, and that's in reference to the pale population that's there now, and that 1% Austronesian marker that just went down to 0.8. In other words, we're confident about what we're looking at when it comes to Southeast Asia. We're confident what we're looking at when it comes to pale European DNA, but we lost confidence in terms of how to define your African DNA. They told on themselves with that feature.
Interesting. So let me ask you this question. Do you think, and again, this will probably be an opinion, I don't know if you know or not, are they actually really sequencing real DNA from the actual Americans that were here before they came?
No, all of this is based on modern populations now.
Which you say may go back about 300 years.
Talking about genetic communities, you're talking about populations that at least intermingled for 2 generations to 300 years among themselves. When you're talking about autosomal DNA testing, they say that autosomal DNA testing reflects DNA that goes back 6 to 8 generations. But the reason why it can pick up markers that go back thousands of years is because people continue to intermingle among themselves. So what took place in ancient times to the 1490s when Columbus came over here to more recent times is reflected in your DNA, because the DNA is like a fingerprint. It doesn't go anywhere because why? The people are still mixing among themselves. You had the Austronesians coming in, and then we intermingled with them, and we started mixing that DNA, and then we kept mixing with ourselves. Then you had other people coming in, and then we kept mixing with ourselves. That DNA is not going anywhere. It's just being recycled.
So if the DNA is actually read right in terms of a historical marker, we could actually see when this admixture actually began from the very beginning if we went back further enough.
Yes, and there are apps that do that, like sequencing. There's a sequencing app. 23andMe gives you a timeline. It's very rudimentary, but it does throw it at you.
So you would think, that these real serious anthropologists and archaeologists that are doing a lot of these private DNA tests, they can actually see where everything truly began for the most part.
Sure. If I could see this, they see it.
Because I know at one point we had a conversation where you were saying that you're able to see the admixture coming into some of the Caribbean populations in a certain time period that were, if I'm using the correct term, some of them were more recent than other admixtures.
Caribbean samples where I could see some DNA matching to southern Italy, Sicily. And this will require, you can't look at DNA in isolation of history. You have to understand the history of those regions. So if you knew what took place in the 1490s to the 1500s and the cleansing out of Moors and Moors leaving Europe and coming into the area of the Caribbean and the area of the colonies that we call the colonies, then we shouldn't be surprised to see DNA like that.
Now, when we, because we have, how can I say this? European DNA, Moorish DNA, then they have Black European DNA, and then they have quote unquote white European DNA or wild man DNA, whatever you want to call it. Can we tell the difference between these types of DNAs and these admixtures?
Moorish DNA, Moor is a term that's thrown out a lot.
Yep.
Some people tell you Moor means dark, Moor means black. Let me just say this. Moor in its proper original term, proper to the indigenous inhabitants of North Africa. The indigenous population there that we call Berbers, they're more properly called Amizigh people. Now, more also extended to the population that was in Northwest Europe, who were the rulers of those thrones, and they primarily were not North African in genetic composition, but were West Africans. Now, West Africans and North Africans crossed. They share lines, but they weren't exactly the same when you look at DNA patterns. North Africans have a different genetic pattern. They tend to have 4 genetics African groups simultaneously. They'll have a Senegambian predominance, Ghanaian Mende, mixed with Yoruba, or some tests will call Nigerian DNA, and some Bantu mixtures. And many of them, if they're not too admixed, will show tiny little Southeast Asian or Native American markers, which is another topic, because people like David McRitchie talked about ancient Americans colonizing North Africa. So I personally think that's where it comes from. But regardless of what I think, without a shadow of a doubt, that is a pattern that they tend to have. And I confirmed that by speaking with geneticists who told me that actually is true. So that confirms what I'm looking at, okay? Now, West Africans tend to have 1 to 2 genetic groups. It will be the Yoruba or the Ghanaian Mende or whatever like that. Both of those types of Africans were in Europe and comprised, pardon me, I'm dealing with allergies, comprised what you would call Black Europeans. Pale Europeans are the population that came in later, who migrated out of Central Asia, who are more like Russians. Yeah. And they came later. But the people who were there were the North Africans, the people who are like the Amizigh people there today. And then later on, during the Roman Empire, you had the West African types who came in later and settled areas around the British Isles and Ireland and Scotland.
Now, with any of these groups, these so-called Moorish groups, in all their admixtures, does any of them have the A00 genetic marker? If you know that?
No. No, they don't. Because when you study the North Africans and the West Africans, they are predominated by the Y haplogroup E. E1B1B is predominant in North Africa, although some of them have the E1B1A, and the West Africans tend to have the E1B1A.
Now I ask that because there's a lot of people who are running around calling themselves Moors, indigenous Moors of the Americas, and if they don't have that A00 haplogroup in them, then they can't really originate from here. Am I seeing that right?
Well, at this point, majority of Afro-American men do not have Y haplogroup A00, but we mixed with the population who did. So we will still pinch and match those sites that are Khoisan or that are ancient. What it is that you have people that identify with the people that came in, and you have people that are identified with the people who were here. That's the best way I can tell you.
Gotcha. I understand.
Some people identified with the people that came here. Moors came here. Moors intermingled with us. Moors were also cleaned out in a modern sense out of Europe and made a bulk of what they would call the African slave population. Now, you did have a transatlantic slave trade, but I can prove, which is going to take a lot of time, and I can't do that today.
We'll have another show on that one.
Yes, I can prove that the main constituent of what they call African slave was not even from Africa. It was actually Afro-Europeans, i.e. Moors. I use the word Moor, Afro-Europeans interchangeably.
Also heard the term Hebrew being used in the Isles of Britain as part of their kingships. Are you familiar with any of that?
You mean like the people like King James and them thinking of themselves as being the Hebrews?
Yes.
Yes.
So
I've heard of that.
what would you consider them to be, do you think? Do you think those are, were they from the African continent, or were those indigenous people from the Americas? What do you think those terminologies of people originated from?
Were mixed, okay? And the part of them that we're calling African, all right, the nobles, they were most genetically similar to West Africans, but they were not from West Africa, because West Africans themselves are not from West Africa, if that makes any sense.
Uh-huh.
They are actually from the Levant. And these individuals, it seems to me they all migrated out of the Levant. One went south, one went north. Now, the Lebanese sample that I talked about, that I told you, has the secondary markers that are Bantu, Pygmy, Lebanese individual, which is a reflection of the population all around him. And it's not just that individual. He also had Igbo, Yoruba, and Brong, which is an Akan group. So that lets you know that those West African groups were in the Levant, which is where he's currently from.
Mm-hmm.
They were once there, and that's in their oral history, but the DNA backs up their oral history. So when you see West African DNA in Ireland, Scotland, we know that the people of Montserrat come out of Ireland. And yet, when you go there, they're all chocolate, melanated people, erroneously called African slave descendants. But if you go to slavevoyage.org, there's only 10 ships that came from Africa that went there. And it wasn't even from the Nigerian area, yet they are Nigerian DNA predominant. Well, how did they get it? It was there in those isles, and it came there from the period of the Roman period.
Interesting. So when we talk about the Arabs, from my understanding of reading history, the original Arabs originated out of, I guess, the area of Egypt, Libya, something like that, which were quote unquote African, as we now understand them. Very dark skin. And then you have what you would call the Persians. Where would the Persians have originated from?
Too familiar with the Persians, so I can't really speak on them. I'm imagining they just come out of that whole area was once of African DNA. When you start talking about Arabs originally, and you still have black Arab tribes that are there, they're the same family as Africans. That's a cultural difference, not a genetic difference. They're the same. That's why when you go to places like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, if you remove the white head coverings or the head coverings off of those men, they will be confused for any Afro-American man. Many of them look like Afro-American men.
Interesting. And then when we get into
that's not a coincidence. They don't even look like West African men, but they look like Afro-American men.
Interesting.
So, and that's, what's also put out there is that's because there was an African slave trade that took in slaves from Africa there. You had an African slave trade without a shadow of a doubt that went into the Arabian Peninsula, but you also have tribes there that are just simply black. The original tribes were black. The newcomers were white. And by the way, that's known by a lot of them over there.
Yes.
That's not even up for debate. That's known. That's known. The whites were the newcomers coming down that mixed in with them, and of course now today the lighter ones are at the top, the blacker ones on the bottom. Welcome to the real world, right? All over the planet. But that doesn't change. That doesn't change the fact that the Arab tribes that are still there are black, and the original population there was indistinguishable from the adjacent African continent. That's all one genetic family. That's a cultural difference.
Well, another thing that I just got finished reading with, they had found the tomb of Genghis Khan. I forgot what mountain it was, but it was over there in Asia Minor. And when they finally went in and opened the tomb, they never described the people that they found in there, but they said it was nothing like they'd expected. And they're trying to figure out exactly who these people really were. And they wrote a different language and everything like that. But, they found something that did not remotely add up to their narrative, which goes into, when you're looking at Mongolian or Chinese history, they do trace a lot of their roots back to quote unquote Africa as well. Am I incorrect in that?
The Khoisan, I would imagine, yes, they do. They do trace it, a part of their lineage, to the Khoisan. Now, I'm not well versed on how they determined it went back to Africa, or do they mean it goes back to African genetics? See, that gets a little tricky.
Uh-huh.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean.
Because it could be what they're tracing as going back to African genetics was already there. Just bear that in mind. I'm not sure, because I'm not well versed on the study, so I don't want to speak on it and I got it misconstrued. But remember, on the basis that we have African DNA, that means we came from Africa. Don't ever forget that. So that same type of error could be made when tracing DNA. You see my point? That DNA was global. That DNA was global. So it doesn't necessarily mean it went back to the African continent. It could mean it just went back to ancient people who were already there, who had African DNA. Because again, primordial DNA was global.
Gotcha.
See, I'm not sure, but
yeah,
that's the point that I'm making.
Well, there was another thing that I was reading here recently as well, is that Israel has completely banned any kind of DNA test for its people.
I heard.
Which is very interesting in terms of...
so if I were them, I would ban it too. I would ban it too. If I were them. So I understand why they did it. You know why?
Well, the narrative that's out there is not the narrative based in reality.
Right. So, see, people like me, if people like me were around, I would ban it. They probably heard my name and they said, you know what, we just gonna make this illegal.
Probably so. because I know you would be on the case.
Right.
And that would turn out to be no joke, though, because of that would have far-reaching implications worldwide as well. Because if things there were found out, like things are being found out here in the Americas, that would change the whole ideology. Well, everybody over there knows exactly what's going on over there in the first place.
At this point, I look all over the internet, and you have people of all kind of hues talking about who's real and who's not real with regard to that. The cat's kind of out the bag with that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The cat's been out the bag with that.
And that's why having these conversations with you on whatever platform is extremely important, because it takes away the fictitious notions and narratives that they put out there, and they root everything in a logical basis that you cannot exercise yourself from if you're trying to make up or create a story. And it's very interesting, all of the DNA stuff. And you being on today is, I tell you, this has been I think I first talked to you about 5 years ago, and I said, oh, I got to get you on the radio, and it's been that long. But you are making a monumental difference in the whole entire indigenous awakening within all of the Americas. I have to tell you that. And
thank you.
And I, for one, talking to you as many times as we talk, was able to put a lot of, how can I say, factual reasoning to a lot of my speculations, and finding out where the truth were and where the truth lies.
Yes.
Or where the lies lie.
Yes, I remember you and I, before COVID, we had a brief conversation, and you already, your spidey senses was seeing a connection with the Cameroon-Congo link and our people. I didn't forget that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you brought it. And I also said that, we were infiltrated. And I said I couldn't really figure out where this infiltration came from. And when we were talking, you broke it down. That there were things that you were seeing within the DNA. When you go back far enough, you can see where this infiltration started. You couldn't necessarily do it through through ancestry, but you can see it in the DNA. And there are certain populations now that basically really haven't changed since the time of the infiltration. They've kept it because they've mixed amongst themselves, as you said before, which shed a lot of light onto, people may look the same, but they're not the same. And this is the reason why we have to make sure that we begin to start not putting in our own narrative, but begin to start correcting the narrative that is out there, so then that way we have the truth and we know exactly what happened and how we can look at a lot of stuff. But you actually showing me these admixtures and breaking it down as you did today was phenomenal.
Yes.
So I'm gonna, I think we made a pretty good case as to the oldest DNA on the planet, and I'm keeping it as making the case, because as you know, as soon as you say that we did something, we're affirmatively affirming this, that, or the other thing, you get people coming out of the woodwork trying to dispel everything. But if somebody else can make a better case for an older, for the oldest DNA on the planet other than the indigenous Americans, have at it, because when you're up against Dr. Fatou, you're heading into a fight with Mike Tyson against the lightweight. She will she'll destroy you. I mean, Mike Tyson said one time, he said every fight plan, everybody's got a plan. He said, but when they get hit once, plan changes to survival. And I don't see many people. There's nobody actually stepping in the ring with you. when it comes down to any of this, because you're becoming the forefront of all things DNA, basically.
Well,
so before we end, do you have any, what do you say about DNA testing itself? Is it viable? A lot of people saying DNA testing is viable. But I think we broke that down as to when you become to, I think it's 23andMe, and you have the 50%, and you can slide it up to 90%. You can see exactly what's really going on. And what do you have to say about DNA testing in itself, between the private corporations or private DNA testing, or the 23andMe DNA testing, these kinds of things? What do you have to say about that?
From which context, I guess, help me along the way. Like,
is it? Can you trust it? A lot of people don't trust the DNA stuff. I don't trust it. They're not really going to tell me.
They shouldn't trust it, because it took me how long to piece together truth from lie. The fact that they identify us by our genetic components, and they give everyone on the planet a genetic community, and don't identify us by our genetic community, shows the deception. So without a shadow of a doubt, I can see why our people don't trust it. But the point is that it still requires some of us to be dedicated to understanding it, because many of our people, unfortunately, because deliberately had their identities taken, they're not on records. Everybody doesn't come from a lineage where they can put their hands on records. Turn to DNA tests to help them. You understand? And yet they were being given these results, which adds confusion. So somebody or somebodies had to take it upon ourselves to help decipher what is going on, to give some understanding to it, because you can't just keep walking around, which is what some of us do, saying this is garbage, this is a lie, when you have people from Italy taking it and is localizing them down to the villages that their forefathers come from. You have Africans taking it now, and is localizing them down to the villages that they're coming from. You have people from Southeast Asia, all parts of Europe, Russia. The whole world is taking it, and literally it's localizing them down to their regions. And then you're standing up there after it gives you a result saying this is garbage. Well, it starts making us look bad, and we're being laughed at. So you need somebody who is willing to sit down and say, okay, well, the results for everybody else are consistent. So therefore, it has to be picking up something that's accurate in me. Now, let's look at it and let's break it down. What is this DNA that they're calling in me? Let's break that down. It still required somebody to take that task, or somebody's, because there's more than one of us out here who's willing to study this and look at that. And it requires you to not be emotional and attached to the results. Now, what I find is the mistake is that many of our people have a visceral reaction to seeing the word African. It's deep down inside, and they know that's not what they are, and yet they have that term being forced down their throats. But in order to truly get at the truth, you have to be detached from the label and what you're seeing, because then you can't tackle it. And see, and that's what I've done. I'm not attached to the label, maybe because, truthfully, my father is an African, so it doesn't bother me to dive into it. You understand? But in order to understand it and to break it down, I had to not give a hoot about the labeling, and I had to go deep into it. Maybe it's also part of my line of work, my profession, by nature, by what I do. People come to me, they have bandages on, and they come for a physical examination, and I make them take off the bandages. Some of them will say, well, it took me X number of to put that on, Doc.
Yeah.
And it's tedious. And then I get the scissors and I say, we're going to cut it open and I need to see what's underneath it. So you have to understand I'm already wired to not look at things by surface value. I'm not wired to do that. You can't come to my office and ask me for a physical exam and then have bandages and think that I'm just going to let that slide. I'm going to see what's underneath that bed. So I approach DNA the same way. So if you're saying that I'm an African, then and everybody else is consistent with their origins, and I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, yeah, the person is saying this is right for me. I'm Italian. This is right for me. I'm Korean, and I'm saying that my mother's from North Carolina, and you're saying, well, no, she's this. Well, let's look at that. And that's what I did.
Yeah. Well,
because the solution is not running from it. Because we're literally matching the level of science that's out there is they can match you to the ancient bones, right? So you can't keep running around talking about DNA is not real, because what happens is when you keep saying that, it makes us look bad. You understand? It makes us look like we don't want to have any labeling associated with the word African. That I know we're not African in a theoretical, in a literal sense.
yeah.
But we have African DNA, and African DNA was global and primordial. See, that's the part they don't tell you, which is what I spent the last hour, plus explaining. You understand? But that requires detachment and studying to reach that state. Just looking at it and saying, I'm not African, it says African when everybody else is matching, it makes you look stupid. I'm going to be very blunt. It just makes you look stupid in an audience, and you cannot be taken seriously if you keep doing that. Because these are computer-generated models. Yes, they are created with a bias. However, everybody else is identifying, and you're the only one that is arguing with the results. So that's why I said it does require that some of us be dedicated to what this is, because it was not designed in our best interest. It was not designed in our best interest. If you do understand it, here's the thing that's great about it. If you do understand it, it can actually unravel things that were mysterious, that you were denied access to knowing because of the nature of our history of not allowing us to claim our true lineages and not putting us on records because of enslavement. It can break through those walls if you understand it. But that wasn't the intent.
Just like it wasn't the intent for them to find out through that, when they tested the African American to see if he had any Davidian DNA in him, because they thought that everybody came from Africa, and they found out that he had he was part of a group that had the oldest and a different haplogroup of A00 than anybody on the planet. So I want everybody to understand, basically, don't be afraid of the DNA. Just make sure that you're with somebody who actually understands DNA and is able to explain it to you properly. Like she said, when you talk about the different groups, you're from Hawaii, but they don't break down, but when you break it down and get into what the DNA actually is, you can begin to start actually really seeing who and what you are.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's the reason why, everybody needs to know a Dr. Fatou. Everybody needs to know. have you on speed dial or something like that, so that way they can really have an understanding of who and what they are as beings of people, and not be afraid of the labels that are given out. And just because somebody says that you're part African, Well, you've been infected with African stuff throughout the centuries because just about everybody on the planet has been, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. You are what you are, and you come from what you come from, and so if you really are set up with the right people to succeed, you can really get the actual, how can I say, results of who you really are. May not be down to the point as to where say, well, I'm from this exact tribe, but it will let you know from what area.
The region. You will know the regions because some of these tribes no longer exist because they were enslaved.
Yeah, massive amount of people were wiped out. And identities.
Massive amount of people were wiped out. But see, we are the survivors of the ones that weren't. Some tribes just ended up being enslaved. So you don't have a literal tribe that's around to connect to. The ones that are around are newly created. Some were around, but, some of them are newly created.
Like I would say...
for example, in my mom's area, you have a Baptist church called the Kahuki Baptist Church. There were a tribe of Indians called Kahuki.
Interesting.
That's what I'm saying. You have little groups and bands and tribes. What happened to them? They were enslaved. This would be people... Like on my grandfather's side, they came out of enslaved lineages. They were not African. They're not related to the tribes that family members who belong to the Lumbee. They're not related to the Halawasaponi. So what are they? They're enslaved other tribes that just don't have a designation today. But when you look at the ancestry DNA at the genetic communities, you will see that my forefathers come out of the genetic communities in those areas. So that lets me know that those tribes were in those areas. We just don't have a name for them. You see my point?
I see your point.
Right.
I see your point.
So some of us may end up finding out that we come from the Choctaw or Choctaw Creek. But some of us may come from tribes that were related to those tribes, but they weren't part of that particular big tribe. A whole lot of us come from these smaller tribes that no longer exist. But I can honestly say they come from the area.
So you make a great point, because when they say the tribe is extinct, it may not have been extinct. It may that they've been consumed.
They were enslaved.
Yeah,
they were enslaved. That's how many of them disappeared. They were enslaved. I don't deny the high death toll, but many of them disappeared through enslavement.
That's a good point. Wow.
Yeah. When I go to Ancestry DNA, and I'm very familiar with the surnames of the tribes in North Carolina, particularly on the Lumbees, the Halawasaponis, the Meherins, the Okanichis. I'm very familiar with the surnames, and I put those surnames to the search bar. And, of course, I'll have distant cousins that I don't know who may be part of those tribes. That doesn't make me a descendant. But if you are a legit descendant, then you would end up sharing so many cousins with those tribes. Well, to make a long story short, when I do the triangulation, my family is not coming out of any of those tribes. I have cousins who belong to those tribes, but I am not a descendant of those tribes. I don't share a lineage to those tribes. Does that mean I'm not indigenous? No, I did the footwork. I know they're indigenous. They just evidently come from tribes that were not created recently, because those are just families that came together and kept intermingling with themselves. It's a newly constructed formation. My family didn't. My family is not coming from those. It's a group of families. So my family's not part of their family, but doesn't mean my family's not indigenous.
Well, so they could have went around, and not just killing individual people or families, but they could have went around capturing and imprisoning whole entire communities as what you call tribal communities.
Right.
And then made them disappear. And then took everything that they had in that area.
Right. They did disappear. And they just enslaved them on their own land, and then they worked on these small farms.
But that's the reason why they really didn't want people going off the plantation, because they probably knew the area better than the people who just got there.
Well, in North Carolina, it wasn't even that many plantations. A lot of people were enslaved just on their own lands, on small farms that were privately owned, just small farms. Yeah. So, you know, when you're talking about tribes, you know, I'm not taking away from the tribes that, you know, got together and petitioned for their right to be indigenous, like Lumbees or Harlawasaponis or Maharans. I'm just saying my family not belonging to those tribes, although I have family members who belong to those tribes, does not make my family any less indigenous.
Yeah, because somebody could have came into your neighborhood and rounded everybody up at a town hall and said, okay, you guys are no longer going to be owning anything, and if you don't do X, Y, and Z, this is what's going to happen to you. And the next thing you know, not only did that community disappear and the name changed, but your whole entire community with all the families that were related to each other also disappeared with the name change.
Right. So you don't have that vantage point that they have. They basically took these are amalgamated tribes, as I stated earlier, and they took matters into their own hands. They also have the vantage point where they were also descendants of free people of color. So they were literate, many of them, and that also helped. So there are a lot of things that went into play. But aware, because and because I understand that my not matching as a descendant of those local tribes, yet I belong to those same genetic communities, that tells me I'm not related to those families. But it doesn't mean my family's not indigenous. And what it tells me is there's plenty of families that had their own genetic grouping or bands or tribes or clans that just went unaccounted for.
Wow, that's a whole. We're into a whole nother show here, so I better leave it off right here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so our people have to understand that we're not going to always get, you know, this Cherokee, Choctaw, Lumbee. We're not going to always get the tribes, because, you know, you have to understand some of these tribes are newly created from other tribes that came together, because, you know, and free people of color tended to mix with other free people of color, and that had to do with the fact that they wanted to keep land, because whites were using codes like black codes to take lands from our people. So free people intermingled with free people. So some of these tribes were created through different indigenous people who were free people of color, and then finally they decided to form a coalition and petition the government for status. It's not that they're wrong to do that. I'm just giving a history created. Now, some of them go way back, you know, legitimately way back, but I'm at least speaking for people like Lumbees, Harlawasaponis, and things like that, and groups like that, pardon me.
Wow, that's Absolutely. This is the reason why, having Dr. Fatou on is so very important, and being able to share the information amongst our people and the people of the world. So, people who are listening over there in Europe, down there in India and, South America, Mexico, up there in Canada, even in Australia, please um, really take a listen to what is actually being said and understand what your lineage is all about and how people ended up really disappearing into the abyss and people not being able to understand where they're from. But, as we heard here today, the DNA is important and it does tell a story. You just need to have the right interpreter, such as Dr. Fatou, to be able to help you to interpret it, this and disseminate this type of information on the real. So then that way, the narrative that's being put out there, whether it's through the orphan trains, incubator babies, or any of these other DNA changing type things that went on throughout our history, can actually be looked at and explained in a proper sense. I really do appreciate you, and hopefully we can have another conversation like this in the not too distant future to go over even more in depth things dealing with DNA and experiences and your studies. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any last words?
Thanks for having me. No, just I encourage people to get into and to use it along with Genie tool and to play with different oracles. Like GEDmatch is free. You download your raw data, you upload it, and just play with it. The more you play with DNA, the more you look at different genetic patterns. Join DNA groups. There are DNA groups where you have a number of people that share their DNA results, and they're created even by geneticists. I think DNA Portal is one of them. But in either case, the more you become familiar with the genetic pattern, you gain confidence to understand what you're looking at.
And we're going to leave it there. We have about 30 seconds left, so much appreciation. I will talk to you very, very soon. And mahalo. Mahalo, doctor. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.